Hello and welcome to the next edition of the HP Discover podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT innovation and how it's making an impact on people's lives. Our next DevOps thought leadership discussion explores the impact on security and how those investing in DevOps models can expect to improve their security, compliance, and risk mitigation efforts. Here to help us better understand the relationship between DevOps and security, we're joined by two panelists. Please join me in welcoming Gene Kim, DevOps researcher and author focused on IT operations, information security, and transformation. His most recent book is The Phoenix Project, a novel about IT, DevOps, and helping your business win. And his new book, coming out soon, is called The DevOps Cookbook. Welcome, Gene.
Dana, great to be here. Thank you.
We're also here with Ashish Kuthiala, Senior Director of Marketing and Strategy for HP DevOps. Welcome back, Ashish.
Thank you very much, Dana. Glad to be here.
Ashish, let me start with you. Coordinating and fostering increased collaboration between the development core, the testers, and IT operations has a lot of benefits, and we've been talking about that in a number of these discussions. But security specifically, how is DevOps engendering a safer code and an ability to work towards an iterative, continuous approach to improved security?
So Dana, I look at security at no different than any other testing that you do on your code. Anything that you catch early on in the process and fix it and close the vulnerabilities, it is much more simple, much easier, and much cheaper to fix than when the end product is in the hands of the users. At that point, it could be in the hands of thousands of users deployed in thousands of environments, and it's really very expensive. And even if you want to fix it there, if some trouble happens, right, there's a security breach, you're not just dealing with the code vulnerability, but you're also dealing with loss of brand, loss of revenue, and loss of reputation in the marketplace. Gene has done a lot of study around security and DevOps. I'd love to hear his point of view on that.
Yeah, it is. You're so right. I mean, I think the promise of DevOps for advancing the information security objectives is phenomenal. But I think, unfortunately, the way most information security practitioners react to DevOps is one of moral outrage and fear, right? And I think the fear that's being verbalized is that if Dev and Ops are deploying more quickly than ever, right, and the outcomes haven't been so great, doing one release a year, what happens if they're doing 10 deploys a day, right? I think it's reasonable to. I think we can understand why they might be just terrified of this, and yet I think what Ashish described is that what DevOps represents is, I think, the ideal integration of testing into the the daily work of Dev and Ops, right? We have testing happening all the time. Developers own the responsibilities of building tests, running the tests. It's happening after every code commit, and these are exactly the same sort of behaviors and cultural norms that we want in information security. After all, security is just another aspect of quality. So I think we are seeing many examples of how organizations are creating what some people call DevOps Sec. It's DevOps plus security. And one of my favorite examples is Capital One. Topo Pal. He described how they actually call it DevOps in their they call DevOps in their organization DevOps Sec. And so, basically, information security is being integrated into every stage of the software development lifecycle, and and I think this is actually what every information security practitioner has wanted for the last 2 decades.
Ashish?
So, Gene, that brings up an interesting thought in my head, right? So, as we look at Dev and Ops teams coming together without security, increasingly we talk about people need to have generally more skills across the spectrum. So developers need to understand production systems and be able to support their code in production. But what you just described, does that mean that some of the developers and planners start to need to become security specialists or start think like that? I mean, what have you seen?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you bring up. Let's talk about the numbers for a second, right? I love this ratio of 100 to 10 to 1, right? So for every 100 developers, you have 10 ops people, and you have 1 security person, right? And so, there's no way you're going to have, get adequate coverage, right? There's just not enough security expertise around. So, just like ops, our goal is to if we can't embed ops people into these kind of project or service teams, then we have to train developers to to care and know when to seek help from ops experts. Similarly, I think we have a similar challenge in information security. How do we train whether it's secure coding,
Compliance.
right. So whether it's about secure coding or regulatory compliance, or how do we create evidence that controls exist and are effective? It's not going to be security doing the work. Instead, security needs to be training dev and ops on how to do things securely.
So are there patterns that they should be looking at in security? Are there any known patterns out there, or there being some developed? What have you seen with the customers that you work with?
What I find so invigorating. By the way, I spent the majority of my career from information security. I was trained as an auditor. I was founder of a company called Tripwire. We were in the enterprise security space, and I was there for 13 years. And I think, I find so exciting in the Capital One presentation at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. Here are the procedures here are the processes that DevOpsSec enables. So you have all the preventive controls in the source code repos, right? So you have your two-factor authentication libraries, you have your OpenSSL configurations, you have all those say two-factor auth, all of those pre-blessed by security, known to be something that's consistent with the organizational standards. You have in the deployment pipeline, instead of having just unit tests being run after every code commit, you actually run static code analysis tools, right? So so that know that it's functionally correct, and the developer is getting fast feedback that they're writing things that are potentially more secure than they would have otherwise. And then alongside in production, the monitoring tools, you'll also be running things like dynamic security testing, so that now you can actually see how it's behaving in the production environment. And I think, in my mind, that is the ideal embodiment of how information security work should be integrated into the daily work of dev, test, and operations.
So, seems a little contradictory in nature, right? I mean, I know DevOps is all about going a little faster, but it's actually, you're adding more functionality right up front and slowing this down. Is it a classic case of going slower to go faster? Walk before you can run, before you can crawl, and then, does it really, in my point of view, it slows you down here. But I think towards the end, you speed up more and you're able to do this.
I would claim the opposite, is that you're getting the best, we are getting the best of all worlds, right? Is that because the security testing is now automated and is being done on demand by the developers, as opposed to you opening up a ticket, Gene, can you scan my application, right? And I'll get back to you in about 6 weeks, right? It's being done automatically, right, as a part of the act of as part of our daily work. My claim would be, not only is it faster, but we have better coverage. We'll get better coverage than we'll have ever had before. And I think the contrarian, the fearful InfoSec person would say, how can you do this for highly regulated environments where there's a lot of compliance regimes in place? I think what I have no doubt about is that if you were to count the number of controls that are continuously operating, right, not only do you have orders of magnitude more controls, but they're actually operating all the time, as opposed to testing it once a year.
So here's what I've observed with my customers. I have two kind of separate questions here, but the first one is, if you look at some of the highly regulated industries, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, it's not just internal compliances and regulations, right, and it's part of security, but they often have to go to the outside agencies for, almost physical paperwork kind of regulatory compliance checks. And, as they're trying to go towards DevOps and they're trying to speed this up, they say, how do we handle that portion of the compliance checks and the security checks? Because they're manual still, right? They're not automated.
Yeah.
Or how do we deal with external agencies in kind of incorporating this in? So what have you seen work really well?
It's last year at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, we had one bank. It was a smaller bank. This year we have 5, including some of the most well-known banks in the industry. We had manufacturing. I think we had coverage of almost every major industry vertical, the majority of which are heavily regulated, and I think they're all being able to demonstrate that you can. Not only can you be compliant with all the relevant laws and contractual obligations and regulations, but you can actually significantly decrease the amount of work. One of my favorite examples came from Salesforce. So selling to the federal government, they had to comply with FedRAMP, and one of the things that they got agreement from security and the compliance groups and change management was that all infrastructure changes made through the automation tools could be considered a standard change. In other words, they wouldn't require approval and review and approval. But all changes that were done manually would still require approvals, right? which would often take weeks. Yeah. So I think this really shows that we can really create this fast path, not just for the people doing the work, but also this makes work significantly easier for the security and compliance groups as well.
And you're taking on the human error possibility in there, and people can be on vacation slowing things down, people can be sick, people may not be in their jobs anymore. I think automation is a really key answer to this, right? As you said.
One of the things we've been grappling with in the industry is how to get DevOps accelerated into cultures and organizations. What about the security as a point on the arrow here? If we see and recognize that security can benefit from DevOps and we want to instantiate DevOps models faster, wouldn't the security people be a good place to be on the evangelistic side of DevOps?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Dana. In fact, I think part of the method behind the madness, the goal of the DevOps Enterprise Summit was really to put proof points on the board. So we had 50 speakers, all from large, complex organizations, and the goal was to get as much coverage of the industry verticals. Just because I think on the Geoffrey Moore curve, right, the innovators, early adopters, those are the people. The innovators were the unicorns: Google, Amazon, Facebook. I think the early adopters were those people presenting. But what the early majority needs to see are people like them, who have already done it and they haven't, and they survived, right? I think we, for the same reason that you just mentioned, I helped co-host a one-day DevOps security conference at the RSA conference, and this was very much from a security perspective, and so it was just amazing to see, find those champions in the security community who are driving DevOps objectives and have really figured out how does security fit into the DevOps ecosystem, because we need them to show that that the water is not only fine, but the water is not only just safe, but the water is great, right?
This brings up a question I would like to ask you, Gene. For any new project that kicks off, it's a new company, you can really define the architecture from scratch. There's enabling you, a lot of the practices you need to put in place, whether it's independent, deliverables and, faster deliverables, all kind of acting independent of each other. But for, still the bigger companies and enterprise software that's being released, we've discussed this in our past talks that, you need to look at the architectural kind of the architecture underneath it and start to see how you can modularize this to do this. So when you start to address security, right, how do you go about approaching that? Because, you're dealing with a large base of code that's kind of very monolithic, like, we talked about. It can take thousands of people to release something out, to the customers. Now you're trying to incorporate security into this. Any new features and functions you add, I can see how you can start to incorporate security and, the expertise into it and scanning it right from the development cycle. How do you deal with that, big component of, the architecture that's already there? Any best practices?
Yeah, I think one of the best people who have articulated the philosophy is Gary Groover, who is here with us at HP Discover. And he said something that just, for me, was very memorable. It's like, if you don't have automated testing, and I think in his context was very much like unit testing, automated regression testing. He said you have a fundamentally broken cost model. It becomes too expensive. You get to a point where it becomes too expensive to add features, right? And so too, is, that's just, and that's not even counting security testing, right? At a certain point, you get to a point where not only is it too expensive, but it becomes too risky, to change code. So, I think that, as Gary Groover also said, who was it that said, marketing is too important to leave it to marketing people. Quality is too important to leave it to the QA department, right? Yes, and so too, security is too important to leave it just to security people. We have to fully empower developers to get feedback on their work and have them fully responsible for not just the features, but just the non-functional requirements, testability, deployability, manageability, and security.
Well, assuming that those listening and reading here today are completely swayed by our view of things, and they do want to have DevOps with security ingrained, are there not also concurrently developments around big data and analytics that, in a sense, give them a better way to do this once they've decided to do it? It seems to me that there's an awful lot of data available within systems, whether it's log files, configuration databases, and starting to harness that affordably and then apply that back to those automation capabilities has got a very powerful synergistic value. So how does it work when we apply big data to DevOps and security? Ashish.
Great question, Dana. So you're absolutely right. With data sources now becoming, an easy, bringing together data sources easily into one repository, right, and at an affordable cost, we're starting to build analytics on top of that. And this is being applied in a number of areas, right? So the best example I can talk about is, how HP's been working in its, it's an IP creation of the area of testing using big data analytics. So, if we are to go faster and we are to release software every hour or every 2 days versus every 6 to 8 months, you need to test it as fast as well. And you can no longer afford to go and, run your 20,000 tests, based on this one line of change of code. So you have to be able to figure out, what modules are affected, which ones are not, which ones are likely to break. And so we're starting to do some intelligent testing inside of our, labs, and we're finding out we are about 85% accurate in predicting what to test and not to test, right? What features are affected or not. I think similarly, using the big data analytics and the security expertise that Gene talked about, you need to start digging through and analyzing, exactly the same way you run as any test, right? What security vulnerabilities do you want to test? Is it, on, which functions of the code? And it's just a best practice, I think, moving forward, that you start to incorporate the big data analytics into your security testing.
Gene?
Yeah, I think you're highlighting, you were implying something that I just want to make explicit. When you're talking about big data, one of the most provocative notions that Ashish and I talked about was think about all the telemetry and all the data that the build mechanisms create. And you start plugging in all the results of testing. Suddenly, we have a much better basis of where do we apply our testing effort, and if we actually need to deploy faster, and even our manual, even if we completely automate our tests, and even if we parallelize them and run them across thousands of servers, and if that takes days, we may to be able to use data to tell us where to surgically apply testing so we can make our informed decision on whether to deploy or not. I mean, that is an awesome potential.
Speaking of awesome potentials, when we compress the feedback loops using this data, when development and operations are collaborating and communicating very well, it seems to me that we're also moving from a reactive stance to security issues to closer to proactive, or certainly, as little time as possible. So, one of the notions about security is that you can't prevent people from getting in, but you can limit the damage they can do when they get in. And it seems to me that if you close the loop between development, operations, and test, that you can get the right remediation out into operations and production much quicker, and therefore almost behave like we'd seen with anti-malware software, where the cycle between the inception of a problem, the creation of the patch, and then deployment of the patch was very, very short. Is that vision pie in the sky, or is that something we can get to when DevOps and security come together, Ashish? Or Gene?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. I mean, I think the way an auditor would talk about it is that, you can prevent. There are things that we can do to prevent, and that's code review, that's automated code testing and scanning, right? And if we can, making libraries available so that developers are choosing things and deploying them in a secure state, right? Those are all preventive controls. And if we can make sure that we have, as best of the situational awareness we can of the production environment, right? Those are what allow quicker detection and recovery. So, the better we are at that, right? The better we are at, effectively mitigating risk.
Interestingly, to my mind, as Gene, you were talking, I was thinking about this. We have this notion of rolling back code when something breaks in production, right? And that's a very common kind of procedure. And then you go back into the lab and you kind of fix, what didn't work, and then you roll it back into production. If it works, it's fine. Otherwise, you roll it back and you do it over again. But with the advent of DevOps and those who are doing this successfully, there's this notion of there are no rollbacks. There are roll forwards, right? So you just go forwards. Because the discipline of DevOps, if done well, you can quickly put a patch into production within hours versus months and days and weeks. And similarly, like you talked about security, once a vulnerability is out there, you want to go fix it. You want to issue the patch. So I think in that way, both DevOps and the way security holds are patched, there are a lot of similarities, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, before we close out, anything for the future? We've heard a lot about the Internet of Things, a lot more devices, device types, networks, extended networks, variable networks. Is there a benefit with DevOps and security as a tag team as we look to an increased era of complexity around the Internet of Things, sensors, and a plethora of disparate networks, Ashish?
I think, the more you talk about the Internet of Things, the more holes are open for, hackers to get in, right? So I'll give you a classic example of, and I've been looking forward to the day where my phone is all I carry, right? I don't have to open my car with my keys, I can pay with it, and we've been, kind of getting towards that vision. But a lot of my friends who are in, high tech are actually skeptical, right? They say, what happens if you lose your phone? Somebody has access to it. And there are counter arguments against that. You can switch off your phone and wipe the data, etc. But I think as Internet of Things, kind of grows in number, more holes open up. So I think it becomes even more important to incorporate your security, planning cycles right into the planning and the dev cycles.
So particularly if you're in an industry where you expect to have an Internet of Things ramp up, getting automation in place, thinking about DevOps, thinking about security as an integral part of DevOps certainly makes a great deal of sense to me. Gene?
Yeah, absolutely. You said it better than I ever could. Yes.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. We've been discussing the relationship between DevOps and security and exploring the impact of security on things like compliance and risk and auditing. And I'd like to thank our guests for a very intriguing discussion. We've been here with Gene Kim, DevOps researcher and author focused on IT operations, information security, and transformation. His most recent book is The Phoenix Project, a novel about IT, DevOps, and helping your business win. And his new book coming out soon is called The DevOps Cookbook. Thanks so much, Gene.
Thank you so much.
And we've been here with Ashish Kuthiala, Senior Director of Marketing and Strategy for HP DevOps. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you very much, Dana.
And I'd like to extend a big thank you to our audience as well for joining us for this DevOps and security discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HP-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening, and come back next time.